Hey, before we start this video, I want to give a quick note, and that is that while recording this voiceover, I am still kind of recovering from a sickness, and so if I sound like I'm running out of air during certain sentences, or I just sound weird, I apologize for that. Hello there, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I've got a bit more of a personal project that I'm really just going to be doing for the fun of it. Several years ago, when I was a bit younger, I didn't have the kind of money that I needed to afford any kind of gaming PC. At this time, I went to a school that had a bunch of desktop computers, several of which they were getting rid of. What I really wanted to do was see if I could snag one of those junk PCs and then purchase a 1050 Ti low-profile card to install into it, hence building myself a gaming capable computer. That never happened for several reasons. First off, I was unable to get my hands on one of the computers due to their recycling contract, and second, I didn't have the money for the 1050 Ti. But now, I do have that kind of money to invest into projects like these because of this YouTube channel, which has been an amazing opportunity to have been given. Plus, I work at that school now, and therefore was actually able to get one of the last ones of the desktop computers that I had hoped to grab years ago before the last of them were thrown out. So, this is a Dell Optiplex 990. And it's one of the exact computers that I wanted to repurpose from their recycling. I'm really excited to see how this PC would have performed, considering that it's got a second generation Intel Core i7-2600 processor, which should be plenty to drive a 1050 Ti. But before I get into turning this into the exact computer that I would have back then, let's firstly check out the Optiplex 990 in general, because being as old as it is, it suffers less from office computeritis that even the systems that came just a couple years after it started to suffer from. And what I mean by office computeritis is the ongoing trend of making office computers less repairable, upgradable, and standardized as time has gone on. Things like putting the PCIe X16 slot on the bottom instead of the top in these Dell PCs is a great example, as this limits you from using a 2-slot card if you want the full X16 link. Another couple examples are the shift towards using proprietary power supplies instead of standard ATX ones, as well as soldering the front I/O directly to the motherboard, making it a motherboard replacement if one of those ports breaks instead of just a front panel I/O module. This system predates a lot of these issues though, as its front I/O is a separate module, and it features some really cool things, such as having 2 physical PCI Express X16 slots, with the one wired for X16 being at the top and the one wired for X4 being at the bottom. It's also got all 4 RAM slots, which isn't as much of a given anymore as it should be, and get this, the motherboard uses ATX power supply connectors. While the power supply's chassis is still of a non-standard form factor, it might be possible to build a Frankenstein PC with an external ATX power supply, and that might just have to be a future YouTube video. Moving on though, I would also like to point out that this cooler is really well built. I actually forgot to clean this PC before benchmarking it, and I did later, which revealed a lot of dust and very dry thermal paste, but still, even though it wasn't set up for success, this cooler was darn quiet and kept the CPU far cooler than basically any newer Office PC that I've had, especially the ones that actually have powerful chips in them, not the ones with Core i3s. The last thing I did on this system was check and replace the CMOS battery, and with that, it's time to add the low-profile GTX 1050 Ti that I bought on eBay. This card cost me $70, and that was a pretty solid deal for it. So yeah, not a great price considering the performance that it will likely get me, but that's the low-profile tax rearing its ugly head. In any case, installing this card was dead simple, and I was able to install it into the X16 slot in this computer, which again is a bit of a rarity these days. And so, now that the PC is all built up, let's get into benchmarking it. I chose to benchmark it in several games, but I also leaned toward the games that I wanted to play at the time, those being mainly Minecraft, Scrap Mechanic, and Raft, which was a pretty new and exciting game. I did also test it in Fortnite, Halo Combat Evolved, Satisfactory, and Spider-Man Remastered though, just to flesh out the test suite a little more and to provide some more data points. Starting out with one of the easiest to run games that I tested today, that being Minecraft. I tested Minecraft Vanilla 1.21.10 with a 12 chunk render distance and an 8 chunk simulation distance. I originally tested it with a 16 chunk render distance and a 12 chunk simulation distance. However, the i7-2600 in this system struggled to generate and process chunks at a rate that allowed for a smooth, playable experience. The average frame rate with these new settings was 202 frames per second, with a 1% low of 22.2 FPS and a 0.1% low of 18.1. Of course, Minecraft Vanilla is easy to run, but what about Minecraft with shaders? Well, using Optifine 1.21.4 and complementary reimagined shaders and the same render and simulation distances, the system managed an average frame rate of 37.8 FPS with a 1% and 0.1% low of 11.2 and 1.3 FPS respectively. So even though this performance is nothing exceptional and isn't meeting the 60 plus FPS standard, it's still incredibly usable and definitely good enough if you just want to screenshot some builds. Moving out of Minecraft and into one of the other games that I really wanted to play at this time, but that my computer could barely run, let's check out Scrap Mechanic. While my computer at the time was barely able to run this game, I do recall being able to play with about 20 frames per second at 1080p minimum settings, and I made do with that because of how badly I wanted to play. However, this system absolutely blows that performance out of the water, honestly by way more than I had expected it to. The average frame rate at 1080p high settings with no depth of field was 83.5 FPS. The percentile lows were great as well, being 58.1 FPS for the 1% low and 22.7 for the 0.1% low. Moving into Raft now, the other game that I really wanted to play, the performance wasn't as incredible, but was still absolutely usable. With all of the graphical settings set to good at native 1080p, this computer gave me an average frame rate of 48.2 FPS, with a 1% low of 34.4 FPS and a 0.1% low of 7 FPS. So a pretty solid performance and absolutely something that's playable, though sadly, the system didn't shred this game to the same extent that it did Scrap Mechanic. Another game that I tested was Halo Combat Evolved, which while I had this for the Xbox at the time, I now thoroughly enjoy playing this on PC. So let's see how awesome playing this game would have been if I had this computer back then. In Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary, at 1080p with normal graphics settings, this system put out an average frame rate of 146.2 FPS with a 1% low of 69.1 and a 0.1% low of 19.5. Definitely a more than playable experience in this title. Now let's move on to some of the harder games to run that I tested on this system, the first of which being Fortnite. Now, while I know that unless cranked, Fortnite isn't the most graphically intense game out there, I have discovered that by including it in my recent tests, it's actually incredibly taxing on the CPU. So I'm very curious as to whether or not this Core i7-2600 will be enough to feed Fortnite, considering it's only a quad-core CPU, and a pretty old one at that. And I've had this game struggle to get enough CPU compute out of even a 6-core 8th gen chip. In Fortnite, at 1080p at the medium preset, this system managed an average frame rate of 74.3 FPS, putting it well above the 60 FPS sweet spot for budget gaming. Then, even though the system doesn't have the strongest CPU ever, it didn't struggle to keep frame times relatively consistent, with a 1% low of 36.2 FPS and a 0.1% low of 16. This made for a very playable experience, which I was especially pleased to see considering the CPU that this GPU has been paired with. Onto the last two games in this set of benchmarks, and arguably the two most graphically demanding games, let's check out Satisfactory. Satisfactory is an Unreal Engine 5 game, making it a bit of a beast to run, especially on these lower end systems. Though a usable frame rate was able to be had at the medium preset, with 36.8 FPS being the average frame rate, with a 1% low of 2.3 FPS and a 0.1% low of 0.9. However, Satisfactory is a stuttery game in general, and so I wouldn't blame the system too much for the percentile lows seen here. Finally, let's take a quick look at Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, and I chose to run this game at the low preset because a frame rate closer to 60 frames per second is really ideal in it due to the fast-paced fight scenes. This PC was able to get decently close to 60 frames per second at low settings, with an average of 51.5 FPS and a 1% and 0.1% low of 29.1 FPS and 12.1 FPS respectively. And that's all the benchmarks for this video complete. Honestly, I was really pleased with the way that this system performed. Sure, it wasn't able to hit the 60 FPS target in every game, and in some games, it didn't even come that close. Still, however, every game that I tested on the system was playable, and I know now for sure that if I had the opportunity to build this system back in the time that I wanted to, I would have been very pleased with its performance. The last thing that I want to do before I end this video is check out what the system is like when I've remembered to repaste and clean the CPU cooler. While the temperatures when it was dirty and had old paste weren't all that bad, especially considering the perfectly reasonable amount of noise it produced, I do want to see what room for improvement there is. However, after repasting the cooler and cleaning it out, I was actually surprised to see only about a 3-degree difference in temperatures. Though the cooler did seem a bit quieter, so it's likely that the fan control in the BIOS is trying to target as low noise as possible, meaning that it runs the CPU relatively hot no matter the condition of the cooling system, and the only major difference from cleaning it out will be a quieter computer. Well, that's all that I have for you in today's video. I hope that you were able to at least enjoy it, and maybe even learn a thing or two. I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.